Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Light from the East by the Imperator, A.M.O.R.C. An article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 21, Number 4, May 1943. Light from the East by the Imperator, A.M.O.R.C. Max Muller, renowned authority on Oriental literature, gave the world the axiom, there never was a false god, nor was there ever really a false religion, unless you call a child a false man. By what shall the religious conceptions of a people be judged? Most certainly not by the extent of their duration. Neither is the value of a religion to be found in the numerical superiority of its adherents. Human experience has too often shown that mass acceptance of an idea has been wrong. The religious consciousness is a complex one. It is born out of primitive emotions, fears, hopes, life values, and an attempt to rationalize the phenomena of the environment in which the individual finds himself. Man has inner feelings. He loves, hates, fears, experiences ecstasy and depression. The cause of these is either apparently obvious to him, or he seeks some connection in circumstances which seem related to them. The cause, actual or imagined, is thus a motivating force, a power to be respected. Consequently, religion has both a psychological and an intellectual basis. Generally speaking, a primitive religion is one where the psychological aspects dominate. It is primarily magical, the belief in a capricious power accounting for the phenomena which man experiences, especially those which play upon his emotions. The enlightened religions are those which embrace intellectualism. They attempt to rationalize the phenomena which touches man's life intimately. Unlike pure science, however, they are not content with explaining how things occur, but why they do, and they seek always to relate the purpose for them to man. The enlightened religion goes one step further. It establishes ethical and moral values for the conduct of man in his relation to the world. The enlightened religionist may know why he does certain things or has certain desires. He may even accept science's explanation for them, but in addition, he puts an appraisal upon them. In other words, his religion has set up a final end, a reason why all things shall exist. Naturally, he does not exclude himself from this. All conduct on his part, which contributes to this end, he conceives as righteous. That which is opposed is to be denounced. Consequently, here again, enlightened religion leans heavily upon the psychological aspect of the religious consciousness. After all, what constitutes right conduct springs in the main from that complex feeling known as conscience. Scientific religion, impossible. For religion to persist, it is obvious that a certain balance between the psychological and intellectual aspects must be maintained. If religion remains too primitive, that is, principally magical, the consequent ignorance results in practices which eventually defy natural law, causing mental and physical ill health. On the other hand, if religion takes on too much of the intellectual aspect, it passes into philosophy, if not wholly into science. There are those who frequently prate about the future scientific religion. It is held up as an ideal. Such an ideal is not possible for attainment. If a deity, for example, can be reduced to, that is, explained entirely by naturalistic principles, physical laws, the religious conception has disappeared. Conversely, no matter how all phenomena may be explained by physical causes, if the initial cause is still held to be an absolute mind, an intelligence, to which an appeal can be made and arbitrary changes made to occur in consequence, we no longer have pure science but religion. If, therefore, there is to be any measure which can be applied to religion to determine its advancement, it must be its contribution to society. If a religious conception causes man to seek to understand the reality of self and his environment, and to master the latter through knowledge, it is progressive. However, as seen, it must go beyond just that, for science accomplishes those things as well. Consequently, if a religion causes the individual to discipline his mind, to circumscribe his passions, and arouses his compassion to the practical extent of causing him to extend charity and justice to his fellows, then it is worthy of the nomenclature advanced. Among men, there is no parity of their psychological and intellectual natures. Some are far more governed by their feelings and sentiments than by their reason. The religion which thus follows from the necessity of their nature cannot be false, though it might be less advanced. In the broader sense, all religion may be looked upon as a step toward eliminating the darkness of mind. When religion first began to emerge from magic, its light consisted of a false knowledge of factual things, as for example the nature of the sun, moon, stars, and even of commonplace things of earth. On the other hand, darkness of mind or ignorance must not be considered merely erroneous ideas, but also the absence of ideas. It is quite patent that a false idea about cosmological origins, the beginning of the world, for example, is preferred to entertaining no idea about it at all. Therefore, it must be concluded that even primitive religions shed light, for they cause men to have ideas about life, existence, and the happenings of their world. The light of religion, so far as history and archaeology thus far have revealed, first shone as developed systems in the Near and Far East. It was when they passed into the West that the great transformation from the psychological to the intellectual took place. And they became advanced, strangely enough, although the merger of the psychological and intellectual occurred in the West. Much of the intellectual aspects of the world's leading religions came from Eastern philosophies. Today, on the whole, most men think of the East as having made its final spiritual contribution to the world. And what now comes from the East is not worthy of consideration by the intellectual Western mind. Actually, Egypt, Persia, and Arabia, for example, are not further influencing the religious minds of the West. Their light now principally emanates from the eclectic religions of the West, namely Judaism and Christianity. The influence of Hinduism. On the other hand, India continues, through actual and self-styled religious teachers, to exert a considerable influence on the peoples of America. Some of these people embrace what is expounded, others condemn it as noxious, and still others are perplexed about it. Have the teachings of Hinduism a worth to the Western mind with its emphasis on rationalism? Are the practices injurious to health? Since there is no false religion, the individual must judge Hinduism only by whether it satisfies one of the two aspects of his religious consciousness already considered. Hinduism is perhaps the oldest organized religion. It is estimated as having come into something of its present form about 1500 BC. It also has one of the greatest number of adherents of any of the large religious systems, approximately 240 million. This number is divided into four main castes. The highest being the Brahmins, the intellectual or priestly caste, the Kshatriyas, the warriors, the Vaisyas, the agriculturalists and artisans, the Sudras, the lowest caste, popularly the untouchables. These four main castes are divided into some 2,000 subcastes. This caste system is the most objectionable aspect of Hinduism to the Western mind. These castes are inescapable and hereditary. Their relative value arose from an arbitrary value placed upon the organs and their functions. The mouth, since words of wisdom can flow from it and it is used to communicate the intelligence, is the highest and represents the highest caste, the Brahmins. The arms depict the Kshatriyas, the warriors, the thighs, the Vaisyas, and the feet, the Sudras. Nature worship. The main theological belief of Hinduism is pantheistic. In other words, Brahma is a divine being, a supreme power which pervades all. Hinduism draws heavily on the Rig-Veda, a collection of lyrics which date back about 2000 BC. The first development of Hinduism, its most primitive aspect was and is nature worship. Primitive peoples everywhere have been awe-inspired by the majesty of nature. The respect and fear alike for it have caused a worship of the phenomena. Only the intellectual development of religion can cause it to depart from nature worship. On the other hand, all religion must and does look with reverence upon nature as a direct manifestation of the efficacy of the deity. The beauty of nature and its mystery have caused man to have an unselfish love, to transcend purely selfish interests, and likewise to experience humility in its presence. Hinduism gives us the following translation from the Rig-Veda, which, though a typical form of nature worship, is inspiring. Let us meditate upon the adorable glory of the divine vivifier, and may he direct our thoughts. A second source of literature which influenced the development of Hinduism was the Brahmanas. These writings are in prose. They came into existence after the invasion of India by other peoples and consist of an interpretation by a certain class of people of the writings of the Rig-Veda. The Brahmanas gave rise to a priestly class whose duty it was to collect fees for the interpretation of the Vedas, the performance of rituals and ceremonies. Gradually, the Brahmin, or the priest, exercised a political as well as a religious control over the populace, and even was accepted as equal to some of the deities. Salvation was thought only possible through sacerdotalism, that is, through the prayers which were offered by and through such priests. So far, Hinduism offered salvation from moral futility and suffering. Veda are replete and second by prayers, fees, rituals and ceremonies as postulated by the Brahmins. The inner philosophy. The intellectual aspect finally made itself felt. Sagacious believers began to seriously contemplate the mysteries of the universe, its cosmology, and the relation of all realities of life to man itself. They wrote lengthy treatises upon these subjects. These essays were not a completely organized system of thought, though they were definitely philosophical. These dissertations are known as the Upanishads, and they were prepared in the era of 800 to 600 BC. Their profundity and cogency are highly commendable. The philosophy of the Upanishads centers in Brahma. Brahma is absolute. Nothing can exceed it, in extent or essence. Brahma is an eternal, infinite, omnipresent, indescribable, neuter being. Brahma is also the spirit, Atman, the world soul. It is what the human personality and consciousness must eventually be absorbed into if the human hopes for peace and happiness. This absorption into the absolute parallels, as can be readily seen, the Neoplatonic doctrines which influenced early Christianity. There is only one reality according to the Upanishads, and that is Brahma, the world soul. The material world to which we mortals give so much credence is but an illusion. Here again there is a great similarity to certain philosophies of ancient Greece, which had their origin 100 years later. Obviously, the salvation offered man by the Upanishads is a freedom from the necessity of the personal consciousness returning again in human form, namely reincarnating. This salvation then consists of being drawn into the one reality, into the absolute, where the personal consciousness remains eternally. The Yoga teachings. The stressing of absorption into the absolute for salvation in the Upanishads gave rise to yoga. Yoga attempts to supplement this absorption method. To yoga, contemplation upon Brahma, the absolute is raised to a formal art. Simply put, yoga attempts to instruct the individual in the way he can have his consciousness drawn into Brahma, the eternal, omnipresent being, the world soul. The system was first set forth in a textbook known as Yoga Sutras. The author is said to be Patanjali. The work is thought to have been written about the 2nd century BC. Oddly enough, though yoga has as its objective the salvation explained in the Upanishads, it adopts a system of philosophy known as the Sankhya. In fact, yoga is now a branch of Sankhya. The Sankhya is a complete, rationalized system of philosophy, comparing favorably with the early Greek rationalistic systems of thought. It is a dualistic philosophy, namely it advocates two kinds of reality, a material world and a collection of individual souls. Systematically, it traces the material world back to a first cause, to Prakriti, primitive matter. However, the Sankhya philosophy may be said to be atheistic, for it admits of no God. Yoga rejects this atheistic view and for its purpose solely weaves a deity into that portion which it adopted. The true central doctrine of yoga is the concentration of thought. This is accomplished by first withdrawing the senses from the objects of sense. In other words, seeking to cause the objective senses to become inactive by shutting out all external perceptions. Second, this is said to have the effect of causing the power of the senses to become just an internal central consciousness. Consequently, thought becomes centered not upon the outer world, but entirely upon the Atman, the self-soul. Third, when this is accomplished, thought and the self are said to coincide. Simply put, all that thought then embraces is a realization of the oneness with Brahma, the world soul. The yoga practice to attain this state requires one to pass through a number of stages, asanas, consisting of counting the inhalations and exhalations of the breath and kinds of intense concentration. One is required to concentrate on a fixed point, for example, the tip of the nose or the navel. This eventually produces the result, known as yoga sleep, yoga nidra, a loss of consciousness, which the yogis regard as sublime state. Actually, Western world psychology knows it to be nothing more or less than hypnotic sleep, which has been self-induced. In yoga, there is a text known as Trataka, which enumerates the methods to be resorted to induce this sleep. For further example, it recommends concentrating with a fixed gaze until the eyes shed tears and the body becomes stiff as wood. This produces a cataleptic state, the equivalent of an artificial death. Strange phenomena. Still another method recommended is to curve the tongue up and backward into the hollow of the throat while simultaneously concentrating the gaze steadfastly at a spot between the eyebrows. Western world psychological tests have shown that the turning upwards of the eyeballs at certain angles and sustaining the position produces hypnotic sleep, which is all this method is. In yoga, it is related that before the sublime sleep overtakes the devotee, he hears such sounds as a drum, a roaring sea, a lyre, a bee humming. Such sounds are either a manifestation of self-suggestion, the result of the effects of a wavering consciousness, or perhaps a strain to which the organs are put produces these sensations. That such methods to enter a subjective state may be extremely injurious to the health of one not thoroughly versed in the practice must be apparent to everyone. Yoga claims that once having induced such a state, remarkable phenomena is accomplished at the will of the practitioner. Such feats are said to consist of invisible travel to distant places, being able to bring back into objectivity knowledge of distant events and happenings. Rosicrucians can explain these experiences as being the result of projection of the personal consciousness, the extending of the mortal consciousness so that it transcends time and space. Such is in accordance with natural law, but the tortuous methods resorted to by yoga. To accomplish it is neither desired nor is it necessary. On the other hand, it is a display of ignorance on the part of anyone of the Western world to claim that such feats are not possible in yoga. Another characteristic of yoga, which does not lend itself to the social structure of the Western world, is asceticism. Yoga shows a studied indifference to the world. The yogi hopes to attain his goal, a psychic ecstasy, by an abnormal means of living. The 4 stages of life. Another great work of Hinduism, a literary contribution to the world as well and recognized by all scholars, is the law book of Manu. It contains influential codes and moral precepts for proper social relations. Its 12 chapters outline, for example, respect to parents, reverential eating, and fulfilling marriage troths. 4 stages in the life of a religionist are set forth. These are known as asramas. The first is the youthful student. This is the period of acquiring new knowledge, of applying oneself to sacred literature and liturgies. The second is the married household. It consists of the religionist's duties to society. Third, the retired hermit. The votary is required to become a recluse and meditate upon his studies and experiences and to contemplate absorption into Brahma. This neglect of family and social obligations in itself is contrary to Western culture and rationalization. The 4th asrama is to become a religious mendicant. One must go about begging his living, despising luxuries and even comforts, and demanding charity from his fellows, thereby cultivating their spiritual nature. He serves them by appealing to their higher selves. A literary work of Hinduism, which has had much translation and ranks high in literature, is the Bhagavad Gita. It is a dramatic poem which quotes the Upanishads. It seeks to justify war for such noble causes as the preservation of religious idealism, for example. The poem relates an Indian knight deploring the fact that in war he must destroy life. His charioteer, who is the chief spokesman in the poem and who is believed to be Krishna, a religious character, explains in comforting phrases that death by war can have no effect upon the soul. To quote a translation by Hume, it slays not, and it is not slain, it is never born, and it never dies. Weapons cleave it not, nor does the fire burn it. The waters wet it not, nor do the winds dry it up. Wherefore, knowing it to be such, thou oughtn't not to grieve for it. Still another literary work of Hinduism is the Puranas. The Puranas, 18 in number, consist of various tales. In fact, a literary translation of Puranas is ancient tales. Throughout all of these works of Hindu literature, the indescribable, eternal and absolute nature of Brahma as a supreme being and world soul prevails. Dangers popular Hinduism. Much popular Hinduism, as introduced in America in recent years, is not worthy of being considered light from the East. It is a degeneration of much of the original Hindu sacred literature. The same may be said for popular Hinduism in India itself, even though it has established innumerable shrines and temples. It advocates the worship of local and general deities, namely the worship of idols, which, for example, is a retrogression in a land where a great many holy places, sacred rivers and pools, many of which are contaminated and disease-laden. Animism, the most primitive of religions, the belief that inanimate things are possessed of spirits, is incorporated in many of these popular forms of Hinduism. If you wish to embrace the light from the East, that which shines from India, make a study of the literature as has been enumerated here, especially that which represents advanced Hinduism. Realize also that Hinduism is not altogether reconcilable with the life and customs of the Western world. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.